Okay, so last week we visited Nepal, and this week we're going to venture to the country of Bhutan. So Bhutan is a landlocked South Asian country situated, as you can see on the map, between China and India. Nepal is to the west. This little strip in here is a place called Sikkim. Like Nepal, it's a very mountainous country. Here you can see from the topographical map. If you remember last week's, well, you can see Nepal over here. It's very similar. You have the three regions. So you have the Himalayan, you have the central region, and the southern region. It's known traditionally as Druk Yui, or the land of the thunder dragon. What would you guess the total population is of the entire country?
Not much.
Less than 1 million. I think the latest that I've seen is about 850,000. It's 14,824 square miles. So it's a small country. For many years, it was very isolated. Still not all that easy to get into, even if you want to go as a tourist. It's a constitutional monarchy. Its major religion is known as Vajrayana Buddhism, which it shares with Tibet, and I'll be saying quite a bit more about that shortly. It's located on the southern slopes of the eastern Himalaya. So you can see on the topographical map where the white snow is. These are the Himalayas. The land consists mostly of steep, high mountains, crisscrossed by a network of valleys and swift rivers, which eventually drain down into the Indian plains and feed some of the major rivers in the Gangetic Valley. Like we said, it's located in the Himalayan region. Let me just go back. The change of elevation, if you go down to the southern regions, that can be as low as 600 feet. And if you go up to the top of the Himalayan regions, we're looking at the average of 23,000 feet. So there's quite and that's because this is what the Indian plate, which we talked about last time, slips underneath the Himalayas and is constantly lifting it up, I think about 2 inches a year. And that's why it's a very earthquake prone region. So back to the Himalayan region. Here we see a picture of the Himalayas, and this is the highest peak, Ganghar Punso. It's I think it's 24,840 feet in height. It's interesting because it has the distinction of being the highest unclimbed mountain in the world. It's not the highest mountain in the world, but it's the highest unclimbed mountain. And that's because of just the difficulty in the topography near the top. Almost impossible to get up to the top ridge. So below that is what is known as the Black Mountains, the more intermediate regions of central Bhutan. It's a major watershed with a couple of major rivers, including the Mochu, which you see here on the right. Peaks in the Black Mountains, the ones you sort of see in the distance there, can range from 5,000 up to 16,000 feet. So even though we're talking about the lower regions, we're still talking about quite high elevation. There are a number of flowing rivers that come out of here and create these river valleys and gorges. Yeah, you can do rafting trips in Bhutan. But there's these beautiful, isn't this a beautiful valley scene here? Just like Nepal, it has some gorgeous terrain, just beautiful river valleys, lush, lots and lots of rain, numerous forests in this area. This is where the Bhutanese get most of their lumber production. I'll just leave these on a little longer than usual, just so you can take them in. Its two main rivers are known as the Torsa and the Manas. They flow through this region. And most of the population lives in this midland region, the forest woodland area. In the south, we have the Shiwalik Hills. Again, lots of rivers. And although, again, we call these hills, here they'd probably be closer to mountains. Even here, you get some of these peaks are up to 5,000 feet. So when you say hill in Bhutan, you got to remember that's a relative term. And then the Ganga or the Ganges also flows through this region and then down into the Gangetic plain of India. Of course, the Ganges being India's most sacred river, it has its origin in the Himalayas and it flows through parts of Nepal and Bhutan as well. In the far south, there's what are known as the Duras Plains. Now we're getting down to almost subtropical type of topography. And these then stretch down into India itself. Climate varies with elevation, as you can imagine, from subtropical in this area here, all the way up to very, very cold in the far north. Bhutan actually has 5 distinct seasons. There's summer, there's monsoon, and of course, monsoon are the rains. There's autumn, there's winter, and there's spring. And Bhutan shares with Tibet and India and Nepal and Pakistan this monsoon season. You may have read about the major floods this year in Pakistan, which were part of this monsoon area. All these areas got a lot of rain. They normally get a lot of rain in the monsoon season. In any case, for example, southern Bhutan averages 200 inches a year. And a large amount of that comes in 2 months. So you get a lot of downpour. And unfortunately, in Nepal, especially, and to some degree in Bhutan, it causes landslides because you have these steep mountains with valleys and roads that might go along them. And when the rain comes, they just get soaked and eventually they come down. Bhutan has, interestingly, a number of rare primate species. There's the golden langur. Doesn't he look cool? Although I must say, every time I see a monkey, but the golden langur. In South Bhutan, you get the Bengal tiger. Mm. These are in the lower lands in the hardwood forest areas. In the temperate zone, you get what is known as the Himalayan black bear. And up in the Himalayan range, you get the snow leopard. Mm. Very rarely seen, the snow leopard. I know National Geographic has a wonderful program that shows the sights of this snow leopard. Very difficult to see. There was actually a wonderful book written years ago called The Snow Leopard by Peter Matheson. He went, it took place in Nepal, but it was a combination of looking for the snow leopard along with his Buddhist journey. If you like that type of read, very detailed on all the plants and animals that he sees, but it's a very interesting read. So the snow leopard is there, as well as this animal, which I haven't actually heard of. Has anybody heard of I think it's called the takin, or sometimes referred to as the gnu goat, GNU. It's actually Bhutan's national animal. It can reach weights up to 700 pounds. So it's a pretty big goat. It's the largest terrestrial mammal that lives in obscurity. You'd have to go to Bhutan probably and up to the higher regions to see this creature. Sort of like the snow leopard, not seen very often. There are also apparently 770 species of birds have been recorded in Bhutan. And this is one of the globally endangered white-winged duck. Isn't he beautiful? Okay, moving away from the topography, the capital is Thimphu, which is in the western central part of the country. Population, roughly 80,000. It's the capital with one of the main center of one of the main districts. Bhutan is divided up into 20 judicial districts. It only became the capital in 1955. Before that, the capital was a place called Punakha. This is one of the old palaces there. It's only about 50 miles away. But the capital, like I said, was moved to Thimphu in 1955. Here's another view of it. It's the fifth highest capital in the world by altitude. It's at 8,000 feet. Like I said, when I was in Nepal, I got up to 12,000 briefly, and after 15 minutes, you could really tell. So even I think at 8,000, you're probably feeling initially a little bit dizzy. It has most of the national political buildings, including the palace, the Chenglong Palace, where the royal family lives. It's a 3-story building. It was built in 1953 because they knew that they were going to move the capital here. You can see there's some trees and ponds. It's a very nice location on the river. The royal family is here, and it's got this what is called traditional Bhutanese architecture, very similar to Nepalese architecture, if you look especially at the roofs. And we'll be dealing with that architecture in much more detail next week when we go to Tibet. Here's a view of the palace at night. Its interior contains something that is called, in French, repoussé metalwork. Lots of examples of this metalwork in the interior. Apparently, it's a technique in which malleable metal is shaped by hammering from the reverse side, then creates a low relief on the other side. But isn't that gorgeous? The detail in that work. Another small town, and I believe, if I heard Barbara correctly last night, she said she visited this town. Is that right, Barbara? Paro? Yep. This is Paro. It's in the far western central part of the country, a very famous valley, and it has the historic town of Paro with its main street here. A picture of its main street. Population 12,000. Not a very big place. Just moving back to this valley, there are a number of very significant religious sites in this valley, and we're going to be visiting in a couple lately. The most scenic, and one of the most scenic of all religious sites, I think, in the world is known as Tiger's Nest, and we'll get there momentarily. So in terms of history, much of early Bhutanese history is unclear because most of the records were destroyed in 1827 when there was a major fire at the ancient capital. So a lot of the historical records were lost. But trying to patch things together from what we know, from what sources do exist, the religion of Buddhism, especially Tibetan Buddhism, was introduced into Bhutan in the early part of the 7th century CE. And it was a result of this Tibetan king by the name of Songtsen Gampo, who actually had ruled over a Tibetan empire from 627 to 649. And he was able to extend that empire down into what is today Bhutan and Sikkim. So Bhutan at one point was part of the Tibetan Empire. And then after his victories, he ordered the construction of numerous Buddhist temples to celebrate the victory in central Bhutan. And like I said, we'll be visiting some of those shortly when we deal with Bhutanese Buddhism. By the 10th century, Bhutan's political development was heavily influenced by the Mongol warlords of China. You've all heard probably of the Mongols. If I say Mongols, most people think of one person, Genghis Khan, who did create the Mongol Empire. But following his death, the Mongols actually divided into 4 subgroups, or what are called khanates. The one that I was dealing with in Russian history yesterday was known as the Golden Horde. That was the khanate that went into what is today Russia and Ukraine and controlled that for centuries. Another major one, however, was the Yuan Khanate, which actually became the ruling power in China for a couple of centuries. And it was that group of Mongols that you could see would influence what went on in Bhutan. But with the decline of the Yuan dynasty in China, Bhutan broke up into various valley groups, warlords fighting each other, a breakdown in authority, and it lasted that way until the 16th century, when this gentleman, by the name of Nawang Namgyal, I must admit my Bhutanese is not perfect, and far from it. In fact, I was trying to, you can find all these pronunciation guides on the internet these days. I couldn't find one for a Bhutanese, so you can find it for just about everything else. But anyway, he was finally able to unify these fighting tribes in the 16th century. He was able to defeat 3 Tibetan invasions. He brought the various religious schools who were also fighting together. So he's often seen sort of as the father of the country. He united it in the 16th century. And he then also he took the title of Rinpoche. I don't know how many of you have heard of that's a Buddhist title used in Tibet, referring to the great lamas or spiritual leaders. And so by taking this title, he was in one sense becoming equivalent to today what we know as the Dalai Lama. He was not only the political leader of this united Bhutan, but he was also its spiritual leader. And his successors then took on very similar roles to what the various Dalai Lamas did in Tibet, and we'll be looking at the Dalai Lamas next week. So during the 17th century, actually, Bhutan controlled large parts of northeast India, Nepal, and Sikkim. It became an empire itself. And then in the 19th century, power struggles again resulted. 2 of the major the rulers, princes in these valleys went into a civil war, and it took quite a while before it was reunited, and it was reunited under this gentleman, Ugyen Wangchuk, and it's his line that still is monarchical in Bhutan. So he was able to reunite the country after a period of civil war, and the current king of Bhutan is part of this royal family. It's from this lineage. He actually finally became king by being selected by a group of monks, government officials, and significant families. 3 important elements that you need for success if you're going to have unity in a country. Then the British get involved, as they were like to do in most things. Because remember, where are the British? They're in India. And so they, in 1910, they come into Bhutan and they want a treaty. And they get this treaty, and it's known as the Treaty of Punakha. This was known as a subsidiary alliance. This is the way the British controlled various princely states in India. What it did, because the British had military power, and these princes recognized it, in return for protection of Britain's military power, the princes handed over certain rights to the British. They were allowed more or less to control their own affairs as long as they didn't disturb the growing British influence throughout India. And so even when India gets its independence, there were something like 20 princely states, each relatively independent within their own realm, but always answering to the British, especially when it came to any foreign policy. So this is what happened in Bhutan for quite a period of time. Finally, when India gets its independence in August of 47, a treaty of friendship is signed between India and Bhutan, and they recognize each other, and Bhutan has more or less independence, as long as it doesn't, similarly with the British, as long as it doesn't do anything that harms what India sees as being dangerous. Because where is Bhutan? It's on the border. And like I said in yesterday's class, one of the primary elements of any political theory is you want to make sure you have a friend on the border. You don't want to have an enemy state on your border. It's always ideal is to have some sort of relationship that is friendly to some extent. So we now move on to this famous king, Jigme Dorji Wangchuk, who became king in 1953 and established a legislature in Bhutan. That was a 130-member National Assembly. And he wanted to promote a more democratic form of governance. Up until this point, Bhutan had been an absolute monarchy. But I think this young man at the time saw the writing on the wall where things were going. He wasn't going to get rid of the monarchy, but he wanted to open it up and democratize it. So he developed a National Assembly. And he began to open Bhutan more to the outside world, supported modernization. And in 1965, he set up a Royal Advisory Council, formed a cabinet. And in 1968, we could pretty much say that Bhutan was a constitutional monarchy. In other words, it wasn't absolute. There was a monarch, but he had advisors, he would listen to the assembly, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there is something I need to mention, and that started in 1988, and it's the image that Bhutan has, and in many ways it's rightfully so, is this very peaceful, harmonious country, which has a general happiness process, which we'll talk about later. But there was some events that took place starting in 1988 that stained this a bit. And it's important to know the whole truth about all countries. So what happened in 1988? Well, in 1988, the government decided to conduct a census in southern Bhutan to guard against illegal immigration. Now, have we heard that term before? To guard against illegal immigration. Sorry, I want to get back to this. So what was done, each family in this area was required to present census workers with a tax receipt from the year 1958, no earlier, no later, or with a certificate of origin, which had to be obtained from one's place of birth. In other words, the need to be born in Bhutan. This was done so that the government could prove people were indeed Burmese citizens and not illegal immigrants coming in from Nepal. Previously issued citizenship cards were no longer accepted as proof. And this resulted in protests arising, protests for civil rights, where these Nepalese immigrants wanted a change to the political system. Some of these protests got violent and started to spread throughout southern Bhutan. And in response, the government increased its resistance. People present at the protests were labeled as anti-nationalist terrorists. After the demonstrations, the Bhutanese army and the police began identifying participants, many of whom were arrested and held for months without trial. The Bhutanese government arbitrarily reported that its census operations had detected in South Bhutan over 100,000 illegal immigrants. The census operations were then used as a tool for the identification, eviction, and banishment of dissidents. Military and security forces were deployed for forceful deportations. And between 80,000 and 100,000 members of this group, known as the Lopchampas, who were Nepalese Hindus, were forced to leave Bhutan. And they had to go to refugee camps in southwest Nepal. Since 2008, many Western countries, such as Canada, Norway, UK, Australia, and the United States, have allowed resettlement. This event is, although, well, I guess it could be quite as violent, but compared to what happened in Myanmar not so long ago, if you remember, when the Buddhists were forcing the Muslim minority out. So again, I mention this only because sometimes we get these idyllic views of places, and there are wonderful things about Bhutan, but this is perhaps a stain on its history. And let's be honest, most countries have stains on their history. So I just wanted to bring this up, not to overemphasize it, but to let you know that these things happen everywhere, even in Shangri-La. Okay, the present king, this Jengme Keshar Nyongmal Wangjuk, is a proponent of democracy and prosperity. He oversaw the peaceful transition, the final, from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy. And in 2011, he launched a program called the Guardians of Peace, known as the Desupos in Bhutanese. These are citizen volunteers who take up the role of what they call nation building. They're trained to help in such areas as disaster relief and the support of charitable organizations. They can be seen as a type of domestic Peace Corps. And they're always recognized by the orange attire that they wear. At the end of 2021, Bhutan had trained a total of close to 23,000 of these Desupas, 8,157 females, and 13,938 males. Most recently, many were deployed to assist in COVID vaccine delivery and helped ensure that the citizens reported for vaccination during, of course, the historic nationwide vaccination program, which they carried out in March of 2021. So that's the nice side. That's the nice side. So now I want to move to religion. And the official religion of Bhutan is known as Vajrayana Buddhism, which is practiced by about 75% of the population. Freedom of religion is guaranteed by the king, and about 20% of the population are Hindu, but they're mainly in the southwestern section of the country, and they have Nepalese connections. So Vajrayana in Sanskrit can be translated as thunderbolt vehicle or diamond vehicle. And it's a form of Buddhism that developed in Tibet and then spread to Bhutan and Nepal. These two objects here are sort of its symbols. The bottom is the thunderbolt symbol, and the top is the bell. So these two are the major symbols of Vajrayana Buddhism. As I said, Vajra means thunderbolt, and it's used to signify. Why do we call it thunderbolt? It supposedly signifies the real and indestructible that exists in a human being, as opposed to the egoistic fictions an individual entertains about him or herself. In other words, humans tend to see themselves, according to Vajrayana Buddhism, in distorted images brought about by social mirroring, where we see oneself, or we see ourselves as we believe others see us. So it's a very interesting notion of what's real and what's not real. And according to Vajrayana, most of us carry around a false image of ourselves, much of it based on our body image, as well as our success image, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the goals of this thunderbolt is to break through that and allow you to see your true Buddha nature. So, like other forms of Buddhism, it believes in the Four Noble Truths. Life is suffering, suffering caused by desire and attachment, the need to become free from that, follow the Eight Noble Path. That is all part of the tradition. But there's also another element, and that's where it has special practices that are designed to help you with this breakthrough, which are the use of symbols, as it were, to break through. Not cognitive breakthrough, not trying to understand it intellectually, but being struck by the use of symbols. And there are four major symbols that are used. There is the mantra, the mudra, the mandala, and the visualization of deities. So what's a mantra? A mantra is a sacred utterance, a word or group of words in Sanskrit or Pali, and other languages, well, Bhutanese, believed by practitioners to have sort of magical spiritual powers when repeated numerous times. The famous example of Buddhist mantra is Om Mani Padme Hum. Go home tonight and say this 3,000 times without stopping. It's meant to actually clear your mind of thought and to just bring it focused on sound. See, the mantra is how you break through repeated sound. And what does this actually mean? The jewel is in the lotus. That's the English translation. The jewel is in the lotus. The lotus is a very popular symbol both in Hinduism and Buddhism, primarily because, as I think I've said a number of times, where do you find the lotus? You find it growing out of mud. Out of the mud emerges the lotus. So this is the notion of the mantra. The jewel is in the lotus. Now, what Thich Nhat Hanh says, and this is interesting, that he's the Vietnamese Buddhist leader who died recently. If you really understand that, and you understand where the lotus comes from, the jewel is in the mud. How does that work? It's because from that mud emerges the lotus. So the mud is that false self that we are talking about. What you want to emerge from that mud is the jewel, which is the lotus, which is the true self, which is your Buddha nature. So that's the use of a mantra. Then there's a mudra. Mudra are gestures, hand gestures. Here we see one of the famous gestures. If you see statues of the Buddha or Hindu gods and goddesses, you'll see this right hand raised. That means no fear. No fear. Because Buddhism, as in other religions, understands that one of our worst enemies is fear. When we fear, then we tend to congeal. We tend not to open up. Fear is the basis of a great deal of violence in the world. So and that's only one mudra. There are 30, 40 different mudras. Another one you may have seen, if the Buddha's hand is pointed down, it's called touching the earth. That means you're centered. You're centered in your Buddha nature when the hand is pointing down. So the mudra is then again used as something you focus on the image of the mudra. You focus on the notion of no fear as a breakthrough to the true self. And then there are the mandalas. Of course, these are beautiful works of art, but what they actually are diagrams, geometric diagrams of Buddhist notions of reality. And if you look in the center of, these are two very famous mandalas, which are found in Japan, actually. But do you see what's in the center of each one? One is, if the one on the left, the center is a little square, the one on the right is a circle. Who's that? That's the Buddha. Surrounded then by all these various bodhisattvas and parts of reality, and outside, some of them will have samsara. But again, the purpose of a mandala is to allow you to focus on reality. It's a visualization. It takes you away from just thinking. And speaking of visualizations, that's the other thing, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, you visualize on various bodhisattvas or sometimes various spirits, sometimes they're even gods or goddesses. You just use these as a visual image. You just, as if you were meditating and removing everything from your mind except that image. And that is said to help you then break through. So what I want to get across here is Vajrayana really uses these techniques as sort of psychological techniques of breaking down the false image of the self. It has all the other components of ethical components of Buddhism with it, but these are the focus rituals, and this is where it gets its distinctive flavor. So let's, as you can imagine, there are some wonderful Buddhist sites, sacred spots throughout Bhutan. Let's take a look at a few of those. This is the known as the Great Dordenma Buddha statue. It's just outside of the capital, Thimphu. It was constructed between the years 2006 and 2015. It's one of the largest Buddha images in the world. It's 169 feet high. We get a little closer in view of it. If you've ever been to Japan, you know there are some very large Buddhas as well. There's the great Buddha of Nara, but this one is one of the largest in the world. Now, what's interesting, it's also a temple. Can you see that below? If you go inside the temple, you will find over 100,000 smaller Buddha statues. Can you see?
There's 1,000.
What's that?
100,000.
100,000.
Oh,
this is, yeah, they're all over the place. This is just one little corridor, and they're all in bronze, and then they're all gold gilded. So this is one of the major holy sites in modern Bhutan. But then if we move down to the Paro Valley, which was mentioned earlier, we get some wonderful old Buddhist sites. And one of the first is this Jowo Temple in the Paro Valley in Bhutan. It's one of the oldest temples in the country. It's a monastery as well, going back to the 7th century. Now, most of these buildings, of course, over time have had some work done on them, but this origin is the 7th century. In fact, you remember when I talked about the Tibetan ruler, Songgon Gampo, who incorporated Bhutan into his Tibetan empire and built temples? Well, this was one of them. It goes back to the 7th century. He built these in what he built actually 108 of these around his empire. They were called border taming temples. In other words, the notion that these temples would help tame the borders. Borders are always your dangerous areas for an empire. That's why you always have guards or walls or whatever you're going to have. Okay, because you feel you have to protect yourself from the outside. In the 8th century, it was believed that this was visited, and here's a little closer view of it, by a Vajrayana master by the name of Padmasambhava. And it was believed that he brought many treasures to this site, and they are contained within the temple itself. Between 1836 and 1838, it was restored, and a new pavilion was added. Can everyone remember what these are from last week? These are prayer wheels.
Prayer wheels.
These are prayer wheels. When you walk along and spin them, every Buddhist temple will have prayer wheels, from these great big ones to small ones. The small ones often are for personal prayer, or personal wishes. These big ones have a special purpose. When you spin these, you help get souls out of purgatory. Buddhism has its own hells and purgatory. These are, again, interpreted in different ways, from actual physical places to mental states. But when you spin the big ones, you're not just spinning for yourself. You're spinning for all those souls who need help. I think I've told you the story one time when we were in India back in 1980, and we were in Gaya, and my daughter Kim was, how old was Kim? About 8? 8. She ran up to one of these and started spinning it. She was really having a great time. And I thought, oh, Jiminy, I better go over and stop her. And the one of the monks ran over to me and said, "No, don't stop. She's doing wonderful merit." So anyway, all Buddhist temples will have these in various sizes. The temple also became associated with this bodhisattva, the Vajrasattva bodhisattva. In Mahayana Buddhism, a bodhisattva is believed to be at one time a historical soul who gained enlightenment and gained the possibility to leave this muck of samsara that we're all stuck in and go to continual peace and harmony. But when they're allowed to do that, they choose voluntarily not to do that. The idea being they're not going to go to nirvana until they help all sentient beings cross over. This is one of the major differences between Mahayana and the original Theravada. Original Theravada was really about your individual effort to gain liberation. The Mahayana ideal is everybody. That's why it's Maha. Maha means great. Mahayana, the great vehicle. So there's this story of Vajravata, and the story goes like this. He was leading a host of pilgrims. This is before he became a metaphysical bodhisattva. This is why he was a great student of the Buddhas. And he took them to visit the Buddha to learn the Dharma, or the way. And so he inquires about the goal of the all-embracing wisdom, which led to a talk by the Buddha, who delivered a sermon. But the audience couldn't understand the teaching. So the Buddha stopped speaking and pulled out a mandala. Now, Vajravata then says, well, how do those rituals and objects, how do they help you gain the truth? I mean, how does that help? So he's what he's doing. He's questioning what will later become one of the foundations of Vajrayana Buddhism. He's saying, how does that help? I mean, if I tell a lot of people, go meditate on a mandala, they can say, how does that help? And the Buddha replies that these are what he calls expedient tools whose function is to bring practitioners to awakening more readily. In other words, the realization that you can hear intellectual Buddhism forever. You can go to Buddha Dharma talks. You can hear someone explain the Four Noble Truths. You can hear all this, but often all that remains as an idea in your head. For some people, and I think that Vajrayana is for most, something else will click. Music, sound, visualization. That's what really moves us to break through. So this is the reason he becomes important, is that he then becomes to realize, yes, this is the way. You don't get rid of the intellect, but the intellect can only take you so far. I think that's the underlying message of Vajrayana Buddhism. And then there's this famous monastery. See where it's located? It's called the Tiger's Lair, or the Tiger's Nest. And it's the little map over here, the pink, it shows you where it is. It's called the Tatsang Monastery. It's on a cliffside in the Paro Valley. Like the Jowa Temple, it's believed that Padmasambhava came here. He brought all sorts of relics with him, and that he meditated here for 8 straight days, and as a result brought great holy power to this place. There it is. The Tiger's Nest. And from the 11th century, nearly every Tibetan, not Bhutan, Tibetan saint or lama has visited this spot to meditate. Now, I must say, if I was going to meditate, this would be a nice place to meditate. What a beautiful spot. Problem is getting to it. There are lots of stairs and rickety bridges that join these buildings. But there's the view of the valley. I think I could meditate there. Now, what's also interesting about this temple, and I couldn't get an image of it, at the highest level, there's this giant frieze of the Buddha, which you would expect. I couldn't find an image of it. In the 17th century, a gentleman by the name of Pema Linga, who also founded many monasteries, came here and apparently was inspired to create a form of dance. A form of dance. Again, this is very Vajrayana. How do you experience the ecstatic? You dance. You don't think about the Four Noble Truths. You dance. And he developed what is known as the black hat dance. And it's danced at these festivals. Now, I'm not trying to put down intelligence. I consider myself a semi-intellectual, but I've also become to realize over my life from the study of religion that that's not the core. The core is not in the idea generally. It's in the experience. And so this dance, known as the dance of the black hat monks, was inspired by Tiger's Nest. There was a major fire there, and it was in 1998. It was restored. A lot of money put into it by the government. And it's said that if you go, a trip to Bhutan is not a trip to Bhutan if you haven't gone here. There's a problem, though. That's how you get there. You got to trek. You got to trek. Now, I must say you can get mules that will carry you there, so you don't have to walk all this. But see the red line over here? That's how you get there. Now, originally that was designed purposefully. Okay. When you went to one of these holy spots, the idea wasn't to drive up, get out, have a good day, and leave. It was a journey. It was a pilgrimage. And that's true if you go to a lot of the temples in Japan or China. Often they're up in the mountaintops. And that was purposeful, the mountain being high up and perhaps closer to nirvana, but also because it took a journey to go there. It was a spiritual exercise, in other words. Okay, let me move on. There's also this famous temple, the Jankalanka temple. It's just outside of the capital. What's interesting about this temple is it's called the Children's Temple. And this is where parents often take children, small children who want to either get blessings from the protective spirit, or children who might be ill and are in need. It's sort of like some of the Catholic spots where you go when you're sick, and hopefully you can be healed. There's a famous festival there. Bhutan's known for its religious festivals, and it's dancing. It's dancing. Okay, briefly, there are also, although there's only 20% of the population is Hindu, there are a couple major temples. There's the Shivalaya Mandir, which is to the god Shiva. And do you remember when we talked about Nepal, the reason Shiva is so important in Nepal is that Shiva's home is the Himalayas. Well, you can see the carryover into Bhutan. So the god Shiva and his wife Parvati, their home base is the Himalayas. So there's this Shivalaya temple, which was actually blessed by the king. He visited it, which may have something to do with the problem on the border with maybe some way to make up for some of the things that happened to those Hindu Nepalese. But anyway, you can see he's offering puja to Shiva. You can see Shiva with a trident, the horizontal lines. There's another major temple to Durga. Durga is a form of Kali. Kali, you may remember, is a form of Shiva's wife Parvati when she's not in the best of moods. She's generally associated with destruction, although as I think we saw last night at the class, that destruction at its higher level is seen as destruction of the ego. But in any case, in Bengal, she takes the form of Durga. If you've ever seen an image of this goddess on a lion, that's Durga. And every year there is a major festival, Nepal, Bengal, Bhutan, known as Dasain. This is Durga's festival. It lasts for a week and it celebrates Durga. And Durga is seen as the one who gets rid of evil. So she's the good force who's always fighting against evil. And so here we see, again, being honored by one of the royalty at the Durga festival. Okay, I want to finish with this idea that has been developed in Bhutan, called gross national happiness, as opposed to GNP, which of course is gross national productivity. So gross national happiness, and this might be somewhat idyllic, let's be honest, but it's a measure of economic and moral progress introduced by Bhutan, by the king in the 1970s as an alternative way of looking at your country. Rather than looking first at the bottom line of GNP, ask yourself, what is your GHP? What is your gross national happiness? And there are a number of elements. These are some of the here: sustainable, equitable, social, economic development, conservation of the environment, preservation and promotion of culture. These are the three key focuses that the government wants itself to be involved in and for people to be thinking of. This includes care for the natural world. Bhutan preserves 60% of its forest cover, and it's mandated in the constitution. You have to have 60% always maintained. So there's constant replanting as well. Symbolic of this idea was the Bhutan king and queen celebrating the birth of their first child by planting trees, thousands of trees. Another thing, and this might sound morbid to us, but keeping death constantly in mind. The Bhutanese people are encouraged to contemplate death 5 times a day. Not to be morbid, but to help ground yourself in your humility. We tend to think we're too important. In fact, in the United States, it's often been said there's been a denial of death. We don't deal with that. That's something that might come later, and it's certainly not going to happen to me. In Bhutan, you're supposed to think about it, not to be morbid, but to remember that everything changes, everything comes, everything goes, and that's part of a natural process. Death isn't a bad thing. It's part of a transformation. So that's another part. Free education and healthcare system. Now, of course, there's only 1 million people, which perhaps allows that to take place. But it has free education and healthcare facilities for all citizens. Now, remember, that was part of a problem with immigration issue, citizen. Yeah, well, this is everywhere, but this is part of the ideal. Primary health care is a constitutional right. It's written into the Constitution. There are no private medical practitioners or private hospitals. Everything's public and everything's free. Teachers and doctors are the top paid civil servants in Bhutan. Then there's what is called focus on peace of mind. You're reminded that you should be meditating some part of the day. Not as a duty, but as keeping this peace of mind, going internal rather than always being bombarded by the externality of what is called samsara. As a result, and the surveys, I don't know how much you believe surveys, claim that the Bhutanese are less ambitious and less materialistic. And then finally, there's the restriction on tourism. Most countries want as many tourists as they can get. Look at the problems that causes for some. Have you been to Venice lately? Mm. One of the big problems, the Venetian population there wants to get rid of the big ocean liners, which I think they finally did, the tour boats, because they were coming in, dropping hundreds of thousands of people off into little Venice. Well, Bhutan has what they call a high value, low impact tourism policy that allows a limited number of tourists each year, and it has to be environmentally and ecologically friendly. And I'm going to finish with one last item because Barbara brought this up last night. The national sport is archery. #1 absolute sport. Each village has its own archery range, and every festival has a high-spirited competition. Archery tournaments happen all through the year, inter-village, national level, and here we see Prince William, I think, about to give an award to the winner of one of these contests. It's not just for the contestants. The crowds really get into it. They're just like at football matches here. They yell and scream at the people they don't want to win, and they encourage those. And it's often said that it's, I guess this is true everywhere, supported by a good friendly dose of alcohol. So in any case, archery, I don't know maybe that'll be a final Jeopardy answer for you somewhere. What's the national sport of Bhutan? You now know. Put that into your knowledge bank. Okay, let me get rid of this and we can talk if we want to. I think if I bring this down. There we go. Okay. Thoughts, comments?
Bill, you showed those two mandalas.
Uh-huh.
Are those paintings, weavings?
They're weavings.
Weavings.
Yeah.
Oh my.
Yeah. They're found in a place called Koyasan in Japan. And they're just marvelous. I mean, you can see if you just clear your mind and focus on these things, it does something. I mean, it's a marvelous experience. Yeah, so those are the mandalas.
I did walk part of the path to the tiger's nest.
Oh, did you? How far up did you get?
I could not make it to the
No.
top, but I did.
Did
give it a
did
good
you see
try.
mules or donkeys going up?
Yes, I
Yeah.
chose my own feet. I didn't trust it,
Okay.
but I gave it a shot.
Yeah,
We
I
met.
have not been to Bhutan. I don't know if I should tell Chris this, but I do plan to go back to Nepal sometime. And if when I do, I think I'll try and include Bhutan and maybe even Tibet in that, if that's possible. And I would like to go. I'd like to go to that tiger's nest, although I don't think I'd probably want to walk it. I'd probably take a donkey or something.
Take a companion.
Yeah. Yeah.
When we were there, we were told that the king abdicated in favor of his son in order to set up the constitutional monarchy.
Yeah. And that's the latest one that we saw was his son.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's still a monarchy, but
yeah.
it's a constitutional monarchy.
But
Whereas
at the
the-
time we were there in 2009, he
Hmm.
was among the world's most eligible rich bachelors.
Well, did you see a picture of him? He was a good-looking dude.
I thought
And he has a bit of wealth. And
after visiting, through that area, that the Bhutanese were among the most physically attractive people.
uh-huh.
Their skin coloring is very warm. They're not obese.
No, yeah.
And they were very generous. They always acknowledged you.
Uh-huh.
And I just thought they were beautiful to look at. It was a pretty, their teeth were intact. And
Yeah,
in
and
these
there's
places I've been, the health has not been good.
yeah.
You can see it in the people.
Well, the advantage that Bhutan has is it has a small population.
Yes. We reserved our place to visit Bhutan 15 months before we went, 15 or 16 months.
Yeah, you got to do that. That's very restricted, which is sort of admirable when you think about it, because think of the money that tourism could bring in. And that's a classic example of GHP being put ahead of GNP.
You mean GNH?
Yeah, GNH, sorry.
Bill, this is Jerry Olson.
Hi, Jer.
Is it for the average American to get into Nepal and Bhutan?
Is it hard?
Yes, is it hard?
Yeah, well, Barbara said there's a long waiting list.
You mean Bev?
Bev.
They
Sorry.
only allow so many
Yeah.
a year, and you can only stay a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
Generally.
Yeah.
And that it also protects their forest and their animal life, because they're not being trampled by tourists to go and
Right.
look at them.
Right.
And it also gives a certain amount of privacy to their people.
Yeah.
They're not spectacles.
Right. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, next week we'll be going to Tibet. We'll get a little bit more about Buddhists there, especially as it relates to the Dalai Lama and the history behind that situation. And so hopefully we'll see you all next week. That'll be our final Zoom class for a while. Down the line, hopefully we'll have some more. But look forward to seeing you next Wednesday.
Thank you
Have
so
a good
much.
week.
I didn't know much about Bhutan and I really learned a lot.
Who was that?
Was that Helen?
I think that was Chris. Yeah. Okay, good. See y'all later.